Good morning. Trust you're having a good 4th of July, that you're being safe. Don't do anything that would be lacking in wisdom, which we'll be dealing with today a little bit. Actually, what we're going to be considering this morning is the pursuit and capture of happiness. How to pursue happiness and catch it is going to be the title. And I think you're all familiar with this building, or at least pictures of it. The United States Declaration of Independence is the pronouncement adopted by the Second Continental Congress, and they met here at the Pennsylvania State House, which is now Independence Hall. And the whole Declaration of Independence was the explanation of why these 13 colonies considered themselves 13 independent sovereign states, and the reason why they were going to war with Britain. And of course, it was the beginnings of the United States of America. And the Declaration was signed by representatives from New Hampshire, Massachusetts Bay, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Delaware, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. And in it, of course, were these memorable words: "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." The pursuit of happiness. We are all in the search for happiness, aren't we? A lot of times we look at it maybe from the standpoint of fulfillment in life, which, I mean, basically that's the real basis of happiness. Is if you feel fulfilled in life, you can have happiness. Where if you are longing with certain things, it's really kind of hard to have any long-term happiness anyway. And as we look around at our society, we see a society that's gone haywire, haven't we? And there's a reason for this, and that's because that we're trying to define the human existence outside of God. And this isn't the first time that this has been attempted, but this experiment's been going on for close to 100 years, and it is not working out very well for us. All we have to do is look around to see that. But if we go over to Ecclesiastes, we find that Solomon, too, was looking outside God to find happiness. And that his world and our world are very similar. I mean, he would have told you so. But, I mean, when we look, they both have injustice to the poor. They have crooked politicians. There's intense materialism. And then lots of folk pining for the good old days. And we all do that from time to time. I catch myself doing the same thing that my grandparents and my parents did to me. You know, Chris will say something. Yeah, I remember when I was young, you know, we'd be able to buy a bottle of Coke for 10 cents and a candy bar for 5 cents. You know, I mean, I could get a quarter and spend it, and it'd last all day long. Yeah, we all do it. You know, the old days were the golden days, you know, and nowadays are horrible days. And sometimes they are. But sometimes it's just looking through rose-colored glasses as well. And we find Solomon, he's kind of the poster boy for the pursuit of happiness. I mean, we're wanting to find how to pursue happiness and catch it, but he was pursuing happiness and not catching it. And if you go over to Ecclesiastes chapter 2, and verse 3, he says, "I searched with my heart how to cheer my body with wine, my heart still guiding me with wisdom, and how to lay hold on folly, till I might see what was good for the children of man to do under heaven during the few days of their lives. And one of the things that's kind of funny there is that it's kind of the nanny government even back then. But, he was going to find out what was good for everybody else. And here he was. He was the wealthiest, most powerful man in his region. And it was all because of choices that he made back when he was like 20 years of age. And God come to him, and during a dream and told him that he would grant him anything he wanted. It's kind of like a story about these three guys that got shipwrecked on this tropical island. And they had been there for a while. They were getting awful tired of just seafood and coconuts, And one day they saw this brass lamp come floating up to the shore, and the one guy got it and got some sand and started cleaning it. And as he did, a genie popped out. And he said, man, I normally give 3 wishes and everything, but since there's 3 of you guys, I'm just going to give you each one a wish, and take it or leave it. But so the one guy, he's like, man, I like coconut, but I am so sick and tired of it, and I dearly love my wife's cooking. If I could just be home at the kitchen table or at the dining room table and waiting for a dinner prepared by my wife, it would be so wonderful. And poof, there he was. And sure enough, he's sitting at the table. You can hear his wife in the kitchen bustling around, and she's, getting everything all put together for him, and it just smells divine. And it's marvelous. The second guy, he's like, well, I'm not married, but one of the things I've really missed is being able to go out on dates and dinners and stuff with my girlfriend. And if I could just be on my way to my girlfriend's house to pick her up to go on a date, it would just be so wonderful. And poof, there he was. And all of a sudden he's driving, and sure enough, as he looks around, he realizes that he's right there on the road to his girlfriend's house and going to be able to pick her up. And the third guy, he's like, man, I'm sure happy for those guys. I'm glad they got what they really wanted. But, I miss them. They were so much fun and everything. And this place is so empty without them. I wish they were both back here. I don't think that they were really friends with him when they got back. Solomon did better in his choosing, and he asked for wisdom, and God granted it along with other bonuses. He gave him the power and prestige and wealth that he could have asked for. And in fact, at the height of his career, they said that he was receiving like 25 tons of gold a year, and that silver was virtually worthless. It was like, the scripture says, it was like stone. He ruled an empire that stretched from the Euphrates River all the way down to the borders of Egypt, and he was married to the Pharaoh's daughter, so he was tied into that as well. And they said in order to feed his royal court, which would be, the whole bureaucracy and family and all the things that would be involved in it, but to feed this, he needed 150 bushels of fine flour, 300 bushels of coarsely ground flour, 10 grain-fed cattle, and 20 pasture-fed, so he was into grass-fed beef, 100 sheep, and as well as deer, gazelles, and geese. Amazing. He also had 40,000 stalls of chariot horses and 12,000 chariot soldiers, even though he didn't really do a lot of war. So, in all of it, he should have been the happiest man on earth. Wouldn't you say? Quite honestly. But when he wrote this book of Ecclesiastes, he's old and he's embittered. He reminds me of one of the, the old guys. You better get off my lawn. I don't want you standing on my grass. You get out of here. One of those kind of guys. And Why? And the only answer that you can find is that he allowed his God-given abilities, all these wonderful things, the wisdom and the wealth and all this, he allowed those to separate him from their source. He got his head turned. He accumulated wives, and he accumulated their false gods, and he worshiped them along with his wives, to keep them happy and all this kind of stuff. And he let his possessions and his power and his pleasures and his prestige and all these things to turn his head. And he forgot what he had told God. Now, notice that it was what he had told God was the most important thing in life. The wisest man of his day was now the biggest fool. If you don't believe me, go read over in 1 Kings. Read his life. It's sad. But in Ecclesiastes chapter 1 and verse 3, he asked the same question that many ask today. What does a man gain by all the toil which he toils under the sun? If we would modernize that somewhat, and to make it our first point, because, you got to have points, it would be this: where do I find happiness in life under the sun? Now, whenever I think of that, one of the songs that comes to mind, when we were babysitting the two girls, they bring CDs from home, we'd play in the car and stuff. And one of them was a Disney one, and it had the song in it, Under the Sea, and the chorus goes, under the sea, darling, it's better down where it's wetter. Take it from me, up on the shore they toil or work all day, and out in the sun they slave away, while we're devoting full time to floating under the sea. I don't know, it has a little calypso tune, Caribbean vibe to it, and kind of cool. But the term under the sun that Solomon uses here is used 29 times in one way or the other in the book. And what it's talking about is life from an earthly point of view. And that's where we live mostly. We get up and we go out and we do our jobs and we come home and we go to bed and we get up and we do that. And it's the daily grind. And that's what we're finding here in this verse. And when it talks about what does a man gain by all the toil which he toils under the sun. And the word toil there means wearing effort. It's the worry of body and mind. It's all the things that we go through. It's not talking about the hobbies that maybe work and sometimes strenuous work. It's not talking about backyard gardening, because a lot of times those things are done from the love of our hearts, from the joy of our hearts, and we find enjoyment in them. And we find that as far as the Bible's concerned, that work, labor, real labor, is not a curse. It's the toil that's the curse. It's that grinding labor that just wears us to nothing and really doesn't accomplish what we want to accomplish. And it's talking about what we have to go through to provide for our families and to keep the wolves away from the door, and what the things that you and I are willing to put ourselves through to find some measure of happiness in our lives. And that brings us to the second point, which is, will I find happiness in what is gained? Again, if we look at that verse, what he's saying is, what does a man gain by all the toil which he toils under the sun? And what do we get from it? What's there? People are constantly climbing the ladder to success. One person was writing about this, said many people are climbing the ladders of success, but when they get to the top, they find that the ladders were leaning against the wrong wall. And I think that's A lot of times the real picture, isn't it? People get to the epitome of what they're seeking, and they find out they're kind of on an anthill, and the real mountain's off in the distance. And some people have gotten to the point that, you know, they've concluded, well, he who dies with the most toys wins. But the problem with that is that everything that I accumulate, I leave behind. And I may have the most toys when I die, but I can't play with them after I'm dead. You know, so it really doesn't help me any at all. One of my favorite resources, Uncle John's Bathroom Reader. I have like 20 or 30 of them. I love them. All kinds of trivia and stuff, but they also have some cool stories. And one of the stories in there was about a guy by the name of Billy Stanley. Now, Billy Stanley was a retired truck driver, and he also had been a rodeo rider when he was a young man. And so after he retired from his truck driving, he went out and bought him a Harley because he thought that maybe riding a motorcycle would be a little bit like rodeo, you know. And he really fell in love with that thing. And after a couple of years, he went to the funeral home and talked to the funeral director there. And he asked him, he said, I would like to be buried on my Harley. Can that be done? The funeral director's like, let me figure out what it costs, but I'm sure we could do it, but it's not going to be cheap. And sure enough, it wasn't. They had to buy 3 plots together so that they'd have enough space to put a vault that would be big enough to handle all of that. Then they had to build the cement vault that would be big enough. And then they had to build a plexiglass container for the motorcycle and Billy to be in and all these kind of things. And he got the plexiglass container and he kept it at his house. And it was like 15 years before he passed away. And so then they took a team of 5 morticians to prepare him, get him in his leathers and all that, and figure out a way to mount him on his motorcycle so that he looked lifelike and all those kind of things. Then they had to mount him in the plexiglass case and figure out a way to lock it in place so that when they're traveling, it didn't fall over and all those kind of things. And they got him there and, you know, picked him up, lowered him down in there. And there was hundreds of people there, and they cheered him on his last ride. And the funeral director was talking about it, and he said, you know, we gave him his last wish and gave him his final ride. And even today, he's riding his bike. Except he wasn't. He wasn't there. You know, and that's the thing is, and this is one of the things that Solomon talks about later. He said, man, I've accumulated all of this stuff, and then I have to leave it for someone behind me, and that guy's an idiot. That's the Dylan version, but it's pretty close. Again, you know, go read it. You'll see that I'm right. And that brings us to point 3. Well, you know, in this pursuit of happiness, how do I find happiness if everything is meaningless? Now, in the past, at church, we've talked about Hebrew poetry. It's different than English poetry, and it's not that I'm any expert on English poetry because, well, my favorite poem goes, roses are red, violets are purple, sugar is sweet, and so is maple syrup. I mean, that just kind of gets you right here, doesn't it? That was Roger Miller. Great poet. But the scholars tell us that Hebrew poetry doesn't have to rhyme. You know, it's kind of like the English free verse or whatever. But what it does have to do is it expresses the same thing in different ways to bring special emphasis to certain points. And it's like Psalm chapter 5 and verses 1 and 2, which to the choir master for the flutes, the Psalm of David, that's the introduction. But the actual poem, give ear to my words, O Lord, and consider my groaning. Give attention to the sound of my cry, my King and my God, for to you do I pray. And if you notice, the first part of that, give ears to my word, and then in the second verse, give attention to the sound of my cry. So those are tying together. He's crying out to the Lord, or he's crying out to my King and my God, which would be my Lord, right? And he says, consider my groaning, or to you do I pray. And so you have these ideas that are expressed in different ways to really bring the point home. Now, that isn't the only way that the Hebrews had of expressing special points. There are places where the Hebrew words are repeated to bring about special emphasis. So if you go over to Isaiah chapter 26 and verse 3, it says, "You will keep him in perfect peace whose mind is stayed on you because he trusts in you." And in the original, the perfect peace is actually peace. And it's emphasizing the peace. I mean, perfect peace is good, but what the peace is talking about an all-encompassing peace. And again, their idea of peace was that makes everything best and better. It's the taking of broken bones and binding them together and all that's involved in the best benefit for us. And he's saying, men, you won't find any better or any greater of this than those that have fully trusted in God and entwined their lives in him. And so then that brings us, and it's kind of a good counterpoint too, but that brings us to Ecclesiastes chapter 1 and verse 2, which says, "Vanity of vanities," says the preacher, "vanity of vanities. All is vanity." 5 times he uses this term. What do you think Solomon is trying to emphasize here? Pretty simple, isn't it? I mean, can you feel the frustration, the realization of emptiness that comes to Solomon as he looks over his life? And I mean, the word vanity literally means empty or unsatisfactory or even futile. And one person said that it's whatever you have left after you break a soap bubble. Solomon accomplished so much. I mean, there's so many things that he did, and again, he'll talk about all this later. But how can a person that is in this place feel this unfulfilled? I mean, he feels so empty. And he goes on in this same chapter. If you go to verse 9, what has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done. And there's nothing new under the sun. And that sounds almost like the guy that was over the patent office in the 1800s here in the United States. And he said, "I'm going to close it down because everything that can be invented has been invented." Of course, they didn't have airplanes yet. Cars were kind of new. I mean, tons of stuff hadn't even shown up on the horizon. The telephones and cameras and all that kind of stuff that we have today. Some of them were rudimentary, but they still had a long ways to go. But as far as that guy was concerned, everything had been invented. But that's not really what Solomon's saying here. When he says nothing new under the sun, he's not talking about the inventions and the innovations, but he's talking about man himself and how that generations come and generations go, but there's no real advancements. You say, well, man, we're so much more sophisticated than they are. No, not really. And the things that drove them are the same things that drive us. And think about over the centuries, one of the things that drives man is the knowledge or the thirst for knowledge, and whether it's going across the steppes and all of that in Eastern Europe and those things back in those days, or whether it was going across the West here in the United States back in the 1800s, or whether it was going to the moon, or whether it was climbing Mount Everest or all that, Edmund Hillary, when they asked him why he did it, he said, because it was there. And that's what Solomon's talking about. Man is constantly driven, but he's never totally satisfied. There's always that longing. And he also tells us in verse 10 and 11 Is there a thing which said, see, this is new? I mean, it's been already in the ages before us. There's no remembrance of former things, nor will there be any remembrance of later things yet to be among those who come after. And one of the things that he's talking about here is one of the sad situations of mankind, is that we never learn from our history. I mean, here we are today, we're trying to erase a whole chunk of history that helped to develop America the way that it is. But by getting rid of that, one of the things that's going to happen is people are going to forget about the kind of lifestyle that had been. And if we're not careful, we'll end up repeating it. One of the philosophers, said that that's what happens. If we don't learn history, then we repeat it. And the thing is we repeat it and we still don't learn from our mistakes. And so technology changes, but human nature and human activity doesn't. It just keeps going. It's just in a cycle. And so you might be saying, okay, well, Brother Steve, then you're saying that I can't find happiness. And I would say, no, that's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is that this world that we live in, and even our government, cannot guarantee our happiness. The government says that it can guarantee our pursuit of happiness, but even then it turns around and starts putting barriers around it, so you got to pursue it within this perimeter, because they feel like that's better for you, and those kind of things. But if we, like Solomon, are looking in this world and in this world alone for our source of happiness, we'll never find it. If we're looking for it outside of God, it'll elude us. It always does. David, Solomon's dad, said it very well in Psalm 37, verse 4. Delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. You see, the starting point has to be God. The starting point is right there. Jesus, over in John 10:10, says, the thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy, but I am come that they may have life and may have it abundantly. And the word life there is not talking about just the biological existence, but the word is Zoe, and it's really talking about what makes life worth living. One person writing about this said, when we try to live our lives, life is just a dull, dispirited thing. But when we walk with Jesus, there comes a new vitality, a superabundance of life. It's only when we live with Christ that life becomes really worth living, and we begin to live in the real sense of the word. Everything else is just vanity, just soap bubbles. Back when I was younger, much younger, 30-some years ago, I was teaching at Gravette, and I was also driving a school bus. I was also working with the fire department and the EMS there, and was in the process of getting my EMS certificate and all those kind of things, but I was already driving the ambulance at that point. And one night, we just got hammered. I mean, it seemed like we'd go out on a run, we'd get home, I'd go to bed, and the beeper would go off again, and I'd have to get up and go again. And this went on all night long. Finally got to bed and got just an hour or so of sleep. And then my alarm goes off because I was, had to be over at the bus barn about 6 o'clock to get everything ready to drive my school bus. Then once I got that in, I come back, and then I had to teach class, and I had to teach class all day long. Then I went out and drove my school bus again. Then I came back, got my stuff, and I had to go to class for my EMT class. And when I got there, I was just dragging. I mean, because, left Gravette, go to Bentonville, so you're driving, and you get kind of, even those curvy roads and all that kind of stuff. But I was wore out. And I knew I wasn't going to get much out of the class. But one of the things that was interesting was they were talking about ventilators that night. And it's not like the big machine you see in the hospital, and they run the tube and all this. This was a fairly nice sized tank of oxygen. It was under high pressure. You had a valve that you could control it with. And then there was a mask, and there was a valve in that mask that when you took a breath, it kicked, and it would just pump you full of oxygen. And like I said, you could set that thing, and when the person took a breath, you could watch their chest it would fill them up like a balloon. And that was the whole reason of the exercise, was that, first of all, the person's semi-conscious or unconscious, and when they do this, it's going to scare him half to death. And you could hit a button and just do it without him even breathing and use it that way too. And he said the best way to understand how this is and what it feels like is for you to do it to yourself. And so we'd set it and everything, and then you put the mask over your face and take a breath, and man, it's like drinking from a fire hose. It just pounds that oxygen in, and it almost feels like you're going to drown in oxygen. But I remember after doing that, how everything just brightened up, and I felt energetic, and the rest of the class wasn't a drag, and I was happy, and I go out and I get in the truck and I head off, and the oxygen wore off, the extra oxygen. And all of a sudden, it was just all I could do to get home again. And a lot of times in our life, we have our little moments of joy, but mostly it's just the drag. It's just the grind. It's just getting through things. And what Jesus says is that he has come to bring the vitality, the spark into our life that we need. And that if we walk with him, that we will have this, and we will have it in abundance. It'll overflow in our life. And basically, it's, the government says we will guarantee the pursuit of happiness. Jesus says, I will help you capture happiness, and you can have it all of your life if you just walk with me. All right. Well, thanks for meeting with us, and I trust that this will have been beneficial to you. And we will look forward to seeing you next Wednesday or thereabouts, or whenever along that line. And I'll be seeing some of you here in just a little bit at church, 9:30 for Sunday school, 10:35 for morning worship. So thank you all for meeting with us. The Lord bless you.